So, on the one hand, you have some form of doctrinal rigidity and a method that is aimed at kind of a grassroots form of preaching that is aimed at purifying the creed, which is opposed on the other side to the more kind of Islamist tendencies, which are much more geared towards the political. This is, to me, how in the book I use different terms. I'm not going to maybe get into that. So the category, the theoretical tool I'm using is grammar of action. So I distinguish Islamism and Salafism by what I call their distinctive grammars of action. And the grammar of action of Islamism is political. The grammar of action of the Salafis is geared towards purity. Right? So, and I use this term of grammar of action because I'm trying to say that I don't like the term ideology. I think it's used too much, and it's used in a way that is much too unconvincing. So I'm trying to find a way to look at what people are doing instead of looking at the idea that there's a clear ideology. So grammar of action is oriented towards studying practice, what people do, not just try to systematize what they say and figure out that there's like something called an ideology. So it is, the notion of grammar of action is really, in my sense, meant towards, again, trying to study people's practices, their actions, and what makes sense for themselves in their actions, how they understand what they're doing. But I'm not going to get too much into that. You can read that in the book later on. It's the kind of more theoretical part where I make this big discussion of grammar of action. So going back to what I'm saying here. In Egypt, this vision of Islamic reformism between one Islamist trend and one Salafi trend is very obvious. Happened in very obvious ways. Because the Muslim Brotherhood was created in 1928, and Ansar al-Sunnah al-Muhammadiyah, which is the first Salafi organization in Egypt, is created in 1926. So you have a 2-year difference between the creation of the first systematic Islamist movement and the first systematic Salafi movement. And both of them work side by side with different goals, as we saw. They don't like each other, by the way, from the beginning. There are a lot of tensions between them. Because the brothers don't understand why the Salafis do not want to join them and why they don't get interested in politics. The Salafis believe the brothers are not good Muslims. They're, not adhering to the proper creed. So there's a lot of debate and tension between those two groups from the beginning. The Muslim Brotherhood is not the subject of my book. It's been studied very much, and it's kind of my critique in many ways, right? I mean, everyone, there's a whole, if you read about Egypt, half of the books about Egypt are about the Muslim Brotherhood, right? And everyone has studied the relationship between the state and the Muslim Brotherhood, and there's like tens and tens and tens of books. This has been the main prism through which people have analyzed Egypt. And I think it is because, of course, it's spectacular. The Muslim Brotherhood and the state have clashed several times. People tend to be attracted by what is spectacular, scholars even. The Salafi movement is much more discreet. It's much less spectacular. It's about preaching. It's not about, it's not about doing demonstrations. It's not about, supporting mass movements. But what I try to say in my book is that you cannot understand religious change in Egypt in the 20th century if you don't reintroduce that element to the equation. So to me, it's not just a standby between the state and the Muslim Brotherhood. It's a triangle where you have the Muslim Brotherhoods, the Salafis, and the Islamists in the Muslim Brotherhood. So those three are three poles of a triangle. And what is interesting is not the kind of dialectical relationship between the state and the Brotherhood. It is that more complex relationship between those three entities. So it is about the more complex relationship between those three distinct entities. Because one thing that is very obvious throughout my book is that because the Salafis were not political, at least from the point of view of the state, they were always seen as a much better alternative to the Muslim Brotherhood. So whenever there was a clash between the state and the Brotherhood, the Salafis would always be spared, because they would always be seen as much less threatening. In some cases, actually, and it's pretty obvious in the last decade of Mubarak's presidency in the 2000s, the Egyptian government actually supports the Salafis against the Brotherhood, because it tries to undermine the Brotherhood by supporting the Salafis, by promoting Salafism as some form of alternative religiosity to the religiosity of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is deemed much more threatening because it is political, right? So, in a sense, the Egyptian government doesn't really care about religious orthodoxy, doesn't really care about what people consider to be orthodox. What it cares about is maintaining its political power. So of course it fears much more from a group that threatens its political power than from a group that redefines orthodoxy. So the point that I make in my book is that because of a number of things, throughout the 20th century, the Salafis have been extremely effective. And I look at different stages, and those are the different chapters in the book. The first stage, I think, is very crucial, and we were discussing it with Mohammed before. It's what happened between the 1920s and the 1950s. It's very often overlooked. But this is extremely important, because from the 1920s to the 1950s, this is the moment of the birth of the religious printed book market. That is, this is when the Islamic books are no longer simply manuscripts kept in private libraries, or editions that are made in small numbers for ulama, to be sold within bookstores for a general audience. So this changes everything, because suddenly the Islamic literature becomes available to all. And it means that at this very moment, and other scholars have written about this, Ahmed al-Shamsi, of course, book on rediscovering the Islamic classics, which is a fantastic book, which I very strongly recommend to those of you who haven't read it. This is a very important moment, because the question becomes, what are we going to put on the bookshelves? And this is a fantastic moment for some of these revivalist movements to redefine what is orthodox. Because the question, most people do not know what is Tawdat al-Azhar. What they know is what they find on top of the bookshelf when they go to the Islamic bookstore. So that moment is one in which the Salafis, that association called Ansar Sunnah Muhammadiyah, is extremely good, very entrepreneurial, at pushing for the others it believes to be orthodox and put them on top of the shelves. There is a fantastic editorial effort, I mean, fantastic in the sense of immense publishing effort being undertaken by the Salafi movement in those years. So while the Muslim Brotherhood are busy organizing in, I don't know, clubs and syndicates and doing like 20th century politics, the Salafis are working on publication. They are publishing books. They are digging into the Islamic Torah to find books that correspond to their conceptions. This is the moment when some authors are becoming very mainstream. Someone like Ibn Taymiyyah is not mainstream before the 1920s. It is probably known to Islamic scholars. He's probably known to Islamic scholars, but he is considered quite marginal in the tradition that dominates the whole Ottoman period. And Ahmed al-Shamsi has a quote, I quote him in the book. He says, in the late 19th century, you couldn't even discuss Ibn Taymiyyah in Ottoman circles because people would just laugh at you. But this is interesting, right? That within a few decades, Ibn Taymiyyah would become a major reference. And that has a lot to do with the Salafi entrepreneurial publishing effort. So the Salafis are very good entrepreneurs. I mean, you could think of Max Weber's argument here, about the Protestant ethics and the spirit of capitalism. There's the Salafi ethics and the spirit of capitalism going on. It's book market capitalism, but they're very good at it, right? Because, I give you an example. They are the first to invent, and this is what Ansar al-Sunnah does, and then Al-Maktaba al-Salafiyya, which is linked to the same milieu of the Cairo Salafi. They're the first to invent the idea of dividing, very long Islamic books of Torah, dividing them into very small books. You see that today, it's very common, right? Because if you want to read, I don't know, Tafsir ibn Kathir, it's very long. Only scholars divide Tafsir ibn Kathir. But if you can sell, let's say, Ibn Kathir by little parts, to very cheap prices, and you put them on the counter at the bookstore and people will take it, this is actually a very useful, very efficient way to get people to acquire these types of books in ways that they wouldn't probably if, again, it was only the big book that was probably very intimidating to them. So the Salafis understand new ways of marketing also the Islamic book. And they do it with the purpose of advancing a certain number of topics. So this is really the moment when you have a form of canonization of Ibn Kathir, who before that also, is the tafsir of Ibn Kathir before the 1920s is not very well known. Which is interesting because today probably most of you would consider it to be a very standard tafsir. But before the 1920s, it is not very well known. I was quoting this from having discussion with Muhammad. So Goldziher in 1924 writes a big book in German, 800 pages, about the history of tafsir in Islam. And he doesn't even mention Ibn Kathir in the 800 pages of that history of tafsir. So in 1924, Goldziher considers Ibn Kathir's tafsir to be so marginal to the grand tradition of tafsir in Islam that it doesn't even deserve a mention in an 800-page book. So this is very interesting because at the time, tafsir would mean for most people At-Tabari, Tafsir al-Jalalain, maybe Baydawi. I mean, you could get into, Muhammad would know because Azharis know this better than me, but Al-Kathir would be considered marginal. So it's really interesting because you start to have a number of authors taking center stage. Now let's be clear here. Those are complex authors, right? And we were discussing this with Muhammad. The tafsir of Ibn Kathir is not per se a Salafi tafsir, just like Ibn Taymiyyah is also open to many different readings. But the Salafis would not just promote these books, they would promote these books because they are ways of reading these books. So that would, they would promote a purpose, but they would also come up with a way of reading them, which is why another author who's written on that period, Ahmed Khan, which I quote in the book, and I quote one of his passage of his text in my book. Many of these Salafi editions were not just about printing a text. They were about the introduction, the footnotes. So it was about, you could take, I think he gives the example of a little booklet that was 15 pages long, which could be printed as a 400-page long book. All the rest was the footnotes and the introduction. And everything to make sure that you read the book the way the editor wants you to read the book. So it's not just about the books, it's about the way you read the books, the difference between the book and the way you read the book. There's scholars like Yahya Michaud, who was a great, a very great scholar of Ibn Taymiyyah, who, until the end of his life, Yahya Michaud, I think died last year, who completely disagreed with anything the Salafis say about Ibn Taymiyyah. He spent his life saying, they don't understand Ibn Taymiyyah. They just imposing their reading on him. He didn't say that. So you can also have disagreements about these authors. But it's about promoting certain authors and then promoting a certain reading of these authors. This was a very important moment because within a few decades, these books would suddenly, the Salafi corpus would start to have a very strong positioning within the field of the Islamic market. And this continued because, as I said, when in Egypt after the period of the monarchy, in 1952, there is a revolution which leads to Gamal Abdel Nasser and the free officers taking power, clashing with the Muslim Brotherhood. Some of you know that story. But Gamal Abdel Nasser doesn't care about the Salafis because the Salafis are not political. So while the clash with the brothers happened and the Brotherhood is persecuted, sent to jail, the Salafis continue publishing books. They continue writing and publishing. So what is interesting is that throughout all these periods, the Salafis always kind of strive. Which is why in the late 60s, when you start to have the Islamic revival, which starts in Egypt as, in many other countries, the Islamic revival in Egypt starts from reading of the Salafi books. And it starts from some of these Salafi spheres that have persisted in society throughout the Nasser era. So when Islamic activism is reborn in the 70s in Egypt, It is a very different form of Islamic activism from the one of the 20s. It is Islamic activism with a Salafi flavor. If you compare the rhetoric of the Muslim Brotherhood in the 30s and the Islamic activism of the 70s, you can clearly see the difference, right? In terms of, again, in terms of attitude to Sufism, in terms of attitude to Christians. It's a big question in the case of Egypt, because Egypt has 10% Christian, 90% Muslims. So Egypt also has this kind of majority-minority question. All of this in the 70s, the rhetoric changes because the new Islamic activism is born from a different theological basis. In the 80s, the Salafi movement, I mean, in the late 70s, sorry, there's an important moment when, I hope I'm not being too long, I know I am, 10 minutes more. In the late 70s, there is a very important moment in Egypt which leads to the formation of the first Salafi social movement. It's called the Dawah Salafiyya. And Dawah Salafiyya is different from Ansar al-Sunnah. Ansar al-Sunnah was a group of ulama who were basically publishing books, doing ulama work. They were scholars. It was kind of a league, a council of scholars. When the Dawah Salafiyya is born in the late 70s, it is born in a context of growing Islamic activism. And it's the idea of making Salafism a social movement. That is basically taking the methods of the Islamists, but not the politics of the Islamists. So organizing from the grassroots into a very strong and social movement with a grassroots presence, quite organized, to make the Salafi ethos preaching not just anymore, how can I say, teacher to pupil, but something that's kind of a more organized, nationwide effort. And this is continues in the 80s and 90s and 2000s. And there's a number of reasons why this continues under the last of these periods, which is the period of Hosni Mubarak. Mubarak comes to power in 1981. He stays in power until 2011 for 30 years. And during that period, you have a number of factors that explain why the Salafis also continue to become stronger. One of them I mentioned before is basically the regime playing the Salafis against the Muslim Brotherhood, which is very clear in the Mubarak period. And I really, in the book, I document very, very obvious strategies to, like micro-local strategies where, the government would support the Salafi movement here because they think the Muslim Brotherhood is too strong here to undermine them. So you have a clear strategy of trying to rebalance the influence of the Muslim Brotherhood by the Salafis in that period. Of course, there's a second factor which maybe many of you have been thinking of, and you've been wondering why didn't they mention Saudi Arabia to this point? Because I don't think it's that important, by the way. I think it is important at certain moments, but it's not as important as people believe. Right? I think there's a whole hype about, it's all about Saudi Arabia. The Egyptian context is much more complicated. The initial Salafi movement at the time of Ansar al-Sunnah did have ties to Saudi Arabia. It's true. It was the 1920s, so it was not Saudi Arabia that had a lot of money with oil and that could fund movements in the way it probably did. And in the 80s, you have that thesis, for instance, that a lot of Egyptians became Salafi because they went to work in Saudi Arabia. My work shows that the contrary is probably also true. A lot of Egyptians went to work to Saudi Arabia because they were already Salafi. So it was the Salafi connection that brought them to Saudi Arabia many times. So that idea that, people went to work and then suddenly their religiosity changed because they were in Saudi Arabia and then they came back as Salafis, actually is probably not completely true. And in many cases it is not. It kind of ignores the fact that Salafism at this point had become an endogenous Egyptian movement. Right? It was not something that was no longer important from abroad. It had developed very strong roots in society. People believed that this conception was correct. And so people did. And so what happened then is that, of course the Gulf still mattered. The fact that Salafism was strong in the Gulf, many of these Salafi movements in Egypt would be able to benefit from that collaboration with Gulf countries. I don't know, some would, I give many examples in the book, and I one question for the Salafis, for instance, in Egypt, was that there were a lot of jobs they couldn't do as Salafis. They couldn't work in tourism, which is a big provider of jobs in Egypt. Salafi won't work in tourism because you might be exposed to sin. You will be exposed to, I don't know, foreign women who might, not follow the rules that you believe in. So tourism was out of the game. Most Salafis also would be very skeptical about working for the government because they would think that, again, they might be able to have to do things. So many of them were actually out of quite a number of sectors which were big job providers in Egypt. The fact that the Gulf provided jobs was key to sustain them. Many Salafis, for instance, became people who did import-export with Saudi Arabia. That was a big thing. They would work with Saudi companies. They would work in businesses connected to either Hajj, but also to Islamic books, Islamic charities, Islamic banking, So there was a whole sector that was connected to the Gulf that would provide a livelihood to many of these people who would not do all the jobs. So the Gulf was really important in that. But again, I don't like this naive idea that, the Gulf can just impose ideas on someone. I think, ideas have a very long life. They take time to get rooted in places. It's not just like, this very easy idea that, the 70s oil, Saudi Arabia, Salafism, they just promoted it everywhere and that's what happened. It has a much longer history and people know what they're doing. It's also making people much too naive to think that people would just change their religiosity so quickly because suddenly, it's that. It was a much longer process in Egypt, one that had much stronger roots. This is what I'm trying to say. There's other factors, and I can't explore them all that I'm looking at in the book. One of them was that, we talk about the Azhar a little bit in the book, because I think in many ways the Salafis were much more entrepreneurial than the Azharis. The Azharis were constrained by the state. The state had a very strong control over the Azhar, especially in the 60s. And so that meant that the Azharis were not as active, as entrepreneurial, as motivated as many of these Salafis were. So the religious field at this point, had some kind of, space to be filled. And the Salafis came right at the time when they could fill that space. That the Azharis were no longer in a capacity to fill, that the Muslim Brotherhood was not willing to fill because the Muslim Brotherhood was more interested in trying to get seats in the parliament. So this is where the Salafis also managed. Again, I always look at these kind of relational sociology. To me, you always have to understand, it's like physics. When one part of the edifice moves, there's always something replacing. You always have to think of the social world of physics. Substances move, atoms move, and when there's a void, another thing moves. So religious change worked that way too. Right? In Egypt, the Salafis were really good because of that too, right? Because there was a void. There was a demand for religion that no other Islamic actor was in a capacity to fill at this point. So I'm going to stop here with a very rapid conclusion because I've been too long. But I think it's pretty obvious that you see that 2011 is really a test of how hegemonic the Salafi religious discourse has become in Egypt. Because in 2011, you have this Egyptian revolution that brings down Mubarak, and you have elections. And suddenly, you have a Salafi political party being formed, which no one expected because Salafis were never interested in politics. So the time no one understands this. Salafis have always said, not interested in politics, we do preaching. Suddenly, they create a party. And I explain in the book why they create a party, but I'm not going to get into that because I've been too long. Maybe we'll go back in the questions. So why would the Dawah Salafiyya, the big Salafi movement I mentioned before, create a party? That's another question I'm not going to address here because I would be too long. But what's interesting is that that party, created 3 months before the elections, gets 28% of the vote. And everyone is like, where did this come from? Like, okay, 45% for the Muslim Brotherhood. Everyone knew they were very strong. Everyone expected that in many ways. But the Salafis, how did this come from? So, in many ways, my book started as a way to try to respond to that question. Where did this come from? And in the 2012 presidential election, for a while, the forerunner candidate is a Salafi candidate. It's called Hazem Salah Abu Ismail, and he is a forerunner for a while. Then something happens with, I mean, the Egyptian revolution is full of these events. The Electoral Commission finds out that his mother has acquired American citizenship. And he gets eliminated from the race. And he contests and says it's not true, although his parents were political exiles in the US. There's a long story, but anyway, he gets eliminated from the race. But it's interesting that the forerunner for a while was himself a Salafi candidate. The Brotherhood, even in that context of the post-2011, they considerably Salafized their discourse to compete with the Salafis. I think, and I will just finish here, I think this is very important because understanding the normative hegemony, this is the term that I use, of Salafism in 2011, is really important to understand many of the things that happened during that period, 2011, 2013, because this fueled political polarization in Egypt. And it's very obvious if you compare Egypt to Tunisia. If you go back to the Arab Spring, Egypt, Tunisia, very different trajectory. Because in Tunisia, what you had was the classic divide. A secular bloc, an Islamist bloc, more or less half and half. 40% for the Islamists, 60% for the different versions of the secularists. So they would end up making alliances. They create the first government, which was in Tunisia, called the Troika, which included the Islamists and then the centrists, and a Labour Party together within a coalition. So two secular parties with one Islamist party within a coalition. In Egypt, things didn't happen that way because there were two religious forces, not one. And that's very important. And the Salafis were playing the game of religious bidding, like basically constantly accusing the Brotherhood of not being Islamic enough. So the Brotherhood could not basically look for alliances at the center of the game because it was constantly challenged to its rights by actors who pretended to be more religious than it was. So that drove the Brotherhood, instead of trying to make like a centrist type of bloc, where it could ally with more secular forces like the Tunisian, and try to stabilize things. The Brotherhood in Egypt was driven by this competition with the Salafis. And that led to the Brotherhood becoming more conservative, the two of them kind of trying to outbeat each other in conservatism, and leading to a complete polarization of the two blocs. And eventually, the secular bloc, in the case of Egypt, deciding that they didn't want to play the democratic game any longer, and turning to the army for help. And that's how the government of President Morsi was eventually overthrown. A coalition supported by the army that included many of these forces that had decided that they didn't want to play the democratic game any longer. So this is very different from Tunisia. So I think that this kind of bidding game that happened with that Salafi element is really important to understand also why the democratic transition in Egypt ended the way it did. Those are many things I've talked about here. The book is very dense. I tried to give you some ideas about it. There's much more in the book, by the way, and I'll finish here because I've said too much. And of course, I'm open to more questions and eager to listen to Mohammed. Thank you.